Our next speaker's getting ready. Real quickly, I want to remind you of the rest of today's events. We'll have speakers every hour up until 4 o'clock. Our last speaker comes on at 4. And tonight at 6 o'clock, we'll be screening The Eyes of Mothman right here. If you've not seen that, trust me, you do not want to miss it. At 9 o'clock right here, they'll be doing the screening the Mothman Prophecies. Do not forget the hay rides tonight. They start at 8 o'clock. Take a trip into the Erie TNT area to find the elusive Mothman in the dark. And they start at 8, run to whenever it ends. It's located at the West Virginia Farm Museum, just north of downtown. Tickets are $5 for adults, $3 for kids under 10. And trust me, if you've not gone on the hayride, you will love it. So, one more time, let's give Jeff and everybody with the Mothman Festival a great big round of applause. They've done a tremendous job. All right, our next speaker is a ghost hunter and author. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Susan Sheppard.
Hello. Well, I have a lot of things to add to this. My experiences, I don't look at the Mothman and some of the things that went on during the time in 1966 going into 1967 as a researcher or really even an investigator. A lot of the reasons is I was about 10 years old at the time, and I was lucky enough that I grew up very close to the one of the first sightings of the West Virginia Mothman, and that was actually in Doddridge County in a little community called Center Point. In John Keel's book, he refers to it as Salem. But the Partridge family, this was the Merle Partridge sighting. John Keel has it as the Newell Partridge. Mr. Partridge's name was really Merle Partridge. And that happened on November 13th, 14th, 1966. And I can recall my sister coming home from school talking about Mr. Partridge and seeing the red eyes in the barn. That story with the German Shepherd dog, Bandit, how it came up missing, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit more. A lot of people ask me, what got you into the paranormal, ghost hunting, other dimensions, unexplained mysteries? I've always been into it. Some of my first experiences happened when I was a small child in Doddridge County, when I was 4 years old. I actually saw some Native Americans up on the hillside from my grandparents' house. This was during the middle of the day in broad daylight, and these two Native American Indians didn't look like the ones I'd seen on television at all. They were dressed very primitively. Their faces were smeared with ashes. They were almost naked, really. I was terribly frightened over this. After seeing these two, whenever you see a spirit, a lot of people don't realize that when you see a spirit, it isn't really ephemeral. It's not transparent. When you actually see an apparition or a spirit, they will look absolutely solid and real. And you don't really realize that they are something from another dimension until they fade or they vanish. And then you realize this. I was a very small child. As I said, I was only 4 years old. And after actually seeing them in broad daylight, and this would not have been very far from the Partridge's home out in Doddridge County that had the first Mothman sighting, I began to dream about these two Native American braves. I dreamed it over and over again. And then many years later, I found a picture of my great-grandmother, and she was not white. It was very obvious she was not white. So I had a DNA test, and it turned out I was one Native American Indian. Came out the tribes are Shawnee, another tribe called Blackfoot Saponi. This may seem far afield from this conversation about the Mothman, the Men in Black. Indrid Cold is something I'm going to cover here in a few minutes. But actually, what I found out a lot of the people who had encounters, whether they be with UFOs, they be with the Mothman, the Men in Black, there's a strong element of Native American blood amongst all of those people. My own tribe, of course, being Shawnee, which would be the same as Cornstalk. That was no surprise when I found that out, really. It made a lot of sense. The Partridge family were also, they were Blackfoot's Pony Indian. So there's some kind of a DNA, a genetic element to these experiences. I know he was talking about the Thunderbirds earlier. So that gives you my start into these visions and experiences of other realms, other places. I can't tell you what these things are, because whatever we say they are right now is going to change, okay? We look upon these things from our own modern, contemporary reference. And I think John Keel actually covered that in his book in talking about the Men in Black and these strange beings, creatures. In the Middle Ages may be interpreted as the devil or any number of things. I think the Tibetans had a name for the Men in Black, which is interesting, bringing up the Tibetans. I hope I'm not rambling, but my particular DNA from the Native Americans came right out of Tibet, as a matter of fact. That's where the migration path of my ancestors came from, and that was the mountains of Tibet. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, when I got to be about 10 or 11 years old, a lot of members of my family began to have a lot of UFO experiences, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But on November 13th, 14th, I can't remember exactly, 1966, Merle Partridge and his family in rural Doddridge County, in a town called Centerpoint. Now, this is a very small town. I bet you right now probably no more than 25 or 30 people live at Centerpoint. My grandmother used to be the postmistress of Centerpoint. It's a country town. John Keel used a lot of poetic license in the Mothman prophecies, in a lot of the different stories. Now, we were lucky enough several years ago, we had Mr. Partridge here, Merle Partridge, at the Mothman Festival. And I was able to interview him. And I remember his Roger Partridge, if you'll recall the story, I'll tell it to you in just a couple of minutes, but his son that went with him to the barn and saw the red eyes I went to school with. He was my classmate. So I remember my sister coming home and talking about Paula Partridge's dad having seen these red eyes, red orbs in the barn, and how the German Shepherd dog named Bandit, which weighed about 75 pounds, never came back home. Since then, I've interviewed the Partridge family. Now, Mr. Partridge passed away. I believe it was a little bit more over a year ago. He would have been in his 80s. But his story differed a little bit than John Keel's. Now, it was about 10 o'clock at night. This was out in the countryside. That Mr. Partridge, Merle Partridge, and his young son Roger were watching television when all of a sudden it began to make a groaning, winding sound like a generator winding up, he said. And as the television set began to make these strange sounds, their German Shepherd dog, named Bandit, began to bark and bark and bark in a very atypical kind of way. And they listened for a while, and Mr. Partridge grabbed his flashlight, and he and his son Roger went outside to see what their dog was so upset about, because it continued to bark. And Mr. Partridge said about a football field away, they could see Bandit at the entrance of the barn, barking and barking and barking. As they got to the barn, Mr. Partridge looked inside and he saw, now this is different, he saw what he interpreted as red rotating lights. Now when he talked to me, he said, red rotating electrical lights, or eyes, if that's what you want to call it. That's what he said. Now, this strange feeling kind of swept over him. Every hair stood up. And this form began to lumber up like this. And the hair stood up on Bandit, and he snarled and he ran into the barn. And for a few seconds, probably not even a minute, Mr. Partridge said he was paralyzed. He was not able to move. And finally, when he broke the spell, you know, if you've ever had the night paralysis, it sounded like something similar to that. He and Roger ran back to the house. They sat down in front of their television set, and the picture came back on. Bandit had stopped barking, and finally they went to bed, and Mr. Partridge slept with his rifle beside of him that night. The next morning, Bandit did not come to the back porch for his breakfast, as he always did, and they remembered they had seen him the night before running into the barn after that lumbering shape with those red electrical lights. This is a very weird thing because that doesn't sound biological, does it? These red electrical lights, he wasn't in there. But what they could see in the barn floor was Bandit's paw prints going around and around in a circle, and then there were no paw prints that led away. There was just a circle, as if that dog had been picked up and carried away by something much stronger and much larger. Now, when Mr. Partridge came to the festival, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, and I saw Mary Partridge, I was talking to her as well, went to school with her as well, and she was looking at the statue, and she said, "Oh, Susan, the feet on this statue are not anywhere near as huge as the ones that we saw in the barn." She said, they looked to her like gigantic turkey tracks. She said they were absolutely huge. Well, Bandit never did come back home. And a few days later, Mr. Partridge, this is out in Doddridge County, quite a ways. In 1966, it would have taken you, maybe 2 or 3 hours to get to Point Pleasant. So he was reading the newspaper, and he read this account about Roger and Linda Scarberry's encounter with the Mothman. At that time, the Mothman did not have a name, and I think they called it the Bird or the Birdman or something like that. And what really grabbed his attention was in this account by the Scarberrys. He read that outside the city limits of Point Pleasant, they had passed the body of a dead German Shepherd dog. And he immediately thought of those red eyes, red lights, and Bandit. Okay? Very interesting. The story did not end there. In fact,